Incubation is incredibly valuable. You can get a ton out of very little if you understand incubation. And we have certain clues in our culture that we're aware of incubation. You've heard people say, oh, well, we should sleep on it if you're making a tough decision. And there's actually things that are going to happen if you do sleep on something. You have taken in the parameters of a problem, and then your brain is going to consolidate the memories of those different points that are relevant to that problem. And maybe any ideas that you had, if there were some that were bad, there's going to be some of those ideas are going to kind of fall away. That's something called fixation forgetting.
Welcome, Model FAs. David DeSalle here, president of Model FA and your host of the Model FA podcast. We have a fellow David joining us here on the show, David Kadavy. And I'm really excited for him to be on. We've talked a lot in the past on various episodes about managing your energy, managing your time. And David is an expert as it relates to mental mind management. David Kadavy, he's the author of the book Mind Management, Not Time Management. And he was also the design advisor to the productivity app called Timeful, which Google actually ended up buying and integrated into the Google Calendar, which you'll have to tell me about that because I use the Google Calendar. So I want to make sure that I'm leveraging that as well. And he also shares insight on how to manage your mental energy on his podcast called Love Your Work. He also has a weekly newsletter called Love Mondays. So without further ado, David, welcome to the show.
David, thank you so much for having me. It is an honor to be here with a fellow David.
Awesome. So before we get into the topic at hand, give us a sense of your background. So your bio had alluded to being a design advisor for Timeful, but walk us through your journey that got you here today.
Yeah, so I was a designer for many years. I worked in Silicon Valley as a product designer, and then I ended up getting a book deal to write my first book, which was called Design for Hackers. So it was geared at software developers. And that was where I actually discovered a lot of the things that led me to writing Mind Management, Not Time Management, which was basically that didn't consider myself a writer, but I was starting to see similar patterns in my thought process between trying to write a book when I wasn't a writer and what it was like to be a designer and have these sort of multivariate creative problems that you're trying to solve, and having that sensation of just feeling completely blocked, but then having these bursts where suddenly the ideas are flowing, they're coming to you easily. Say you're writing and you just can't write anything. And then all of a sudden for 15 minutes, you write everything that you've been trying to write for the last several weeks. And that's where I started to dig into those patterns and come up with the stuff that ended up being in Mind Management, Not Time Management. And also through that journey, ended up working with the behavioral scientist, Dan Ariely, on the app Timeful. And then that got purchased by Google, as mentioned before.
Awesome. And where I'm kind of doing this live here on the show, but if I'm on my Google Calendar, where could I sniff out that feature? Do you know where that lives by chance?
Well, I mean, it's hard to know what's going on in the back end that might be a Timeful feature, but if Google Calendar, I think it might still have this goals feature, which is basically that you could say that you wanted to jog 3 times a week, and using machine learning, it would find the optimal times for you to be able to complete that task. And that would be a feature from Timeful.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I just Googled it and I got some step-by-step instructions here. So I'll take a look at that afterwards. Very goal-oriented myself. So perhaps that could be helpful and even woven into some of our coaching for clients. And I'm interested too to learn more about kind of what you were alluding to with those bursts of energy where things just tend to come to you at that. It makes me think of flow state. So excited to dive into that and maybe things that you can do to kind of trigger or initiate that state of being. But I want to start a little bit more generally first. So we help a lot of folks with kind of 2 main things. One is time management. So calendarizing as much as possible. That way you just have to think less throughout the day and you just do what your calendar tells you to do. And sometimes people think that's too regimented and doesn't really promote freedom, but it's amazing how being very diligent with your calendar actually does feel freeing, assuming that you're scheduling in your personal stuff as well and not just filling it all with work. And then also we have something called an energy audit, which is basically taking folks through an exercise, identifying 4 different areas, one being your zone of genius all the way over to your zone of incompetence. And there's a couple others in there in between. So I'm curious to hear how mind management sort of dovetails into those things. So I guess give me sort of a general overview of when you say mind management, what do you actually mean? Like, what are you getting at in that topic?
Well, I'll start with kind of what it's going against, which is this idea that time management is a kind of outdated concept when taken to its extreme. It is obviously a foundation of being productive. But if we really go back to where time management started, it was with scientific management, Frederick Taylor, breaking down tasks into steps that can be timed and then be prescribed so that you can follow them. And that was certainly true in the industrial age. If you're doing actual work, moving matter around, moving bricks around, moving chunks of iron around the steel yard at Bethlehem Steel, which was the studies that Frederick Taylor was doing. And then, you can use that in some knowledge work as well to an extent. But then when it starts to become time to be creative and to have ideas and to do things that are going to have outsized value when compared to the time that you're putting in, like it doesn't take much time to have an idea, but the potential scale of value of an idea can go from infinitely worthless to infinitely valuable. And so when you consider that, then it starts to become clear that this idea that time management proposes, which is that a unit of time put into a task, therefore results in a unit of output from that task or from that productivity, that's actually a pretty flawed concept. I mean, if you are spending 12 hours a day trying to come up with an idea and all of a sudden you're able to have that idea and it takes you a few minutes to implement it or write that thing and put everything together, that's where you start to wonder, like, well, what is the value of time when it comes to being productive? So that's why I think that some of what you're talking about really does dovetail. This idea of an energy audit sounds a lot like what I think of when it comes to getting an idea of when you have certain types of energy throughout the week. Not so much do you have a lot of energy and a little energy, because when you look at the creative process or thinking creatively, there are times where you have energy, but you're not necessarily creative at that time. Maybe you're very good at analytical work. That's a time when you can do things where you're able to do a lot of context switching mentally. And there might be another time where you have energy, but you're not so well suited for that sort of stuff. So I think I take it beyond, I don't know what your energy audit is like, but I take it beyond this idea of, do you have a lot of energy or do you not, to what kind of energy is it? What is it best suited for, given the types of tasks mentally that you are trying to execute throughout your day and your week?
So, as you know, our audience is financial advisors, and there's a variety of different activities that advisors do on a daily and weekly business. And let me kind of rattle off some, and then I'm going to ask you a question that's relevant to that. So an advisor, is responsible for their marketing, their client service, right? Meeting with clients. They're responsible for developing business. They're responsible for running their own business as well. They're responsible for the systems and processes within the business, making sure that those are running smoothly and are positioned to scale. They're responsible for hiring and firing, human talent. Mm-hmm. They're responsible for evaluating various tech solutions. So there's a lot of various things that they need to juggle on an ongoing basis. So I'm curious to know, David, when you think of like time management compared to mind management, you mentioned that time management is outdated, but also it's still foundational in certain aspects. So I'm
Yes.
curious to know, with some of the things that I listed off, where does someone need to be very cognizant of their mind management on doing certain things? Is it everything? Is it more of the creative stuff like marketing? And then I have a more tactful sort of follow-up question as to
Yeah.
how to, get the creative juices flowing when needed. But how would you respond to that? Did I give you enough information on that?
Sure, absolutely. So, yeah, a lot of different tasks and a lot of different mental states that you need to inhabit to execute those tasks. And also, probably a lot of those tasks you find sometimes it's happening and you're firing on all cylinders, it seems. And then other times, maybe you're having a hard time thinking of what are the better systems for you to set up in your business. Well, probably because you're also like putting out fires and trying to deal with the blowback of having the lack of systems in there. And to get into that creative state where you are able to think about what are the moving parts in this business and how can I set up some kind of system so that things that are happening on some sort of repeated basis are happening a lot more smoothly. I mean, it takes a lot of creativity to get into that state. So I think that's kind of where to start is what are those tasks where you find yourself either struggling to do it or having an extremely high value idea. I think of that with building systems, like you mentioned, and then maybe with marketing, if you have some ideas that you're trying to come up with, those can have an outsized impact on your business, depending upon whether it's a really good idea or not a very good idea. Then you have the things that you probably kind of need to do, like meeting with clients. You probably kind of need to do that. And then, might not have a lot of flexibility with that, or maybe you do. There might be some of you who say, well, these days I meet with clients and these days I do not. So I think thinking about those different parameters about what you need to do and what compromises you can make and what things require a great deal of creative energy and can have a huge impact. Through identifying those things, you can kind of think about the big rocks first of, say, if you are feeling like you really need better systems in your business, maybe you have like what I like to call a prefrontal Monday, where you have incubated things over the weekend and you have sort of recharged and you're showing up on Monday morning and hopefully there's not some sort of storm hitting you in the face. And you can maybe sit down with a notebook away from electronics and such and think about what would I like to see happen in my business and what are systems I can put in place? What are decisions that I can make that aren't going to be so obvious in the moment that I could implement? And maybe you aren't doing that at that particular moment, implementing them, but you might be using that time to think about those things. That could be some kind of ritual that maybe you do it every Monday forever, or maybe it's every Monday, during the last quarter of the year, or every Monday for a month, or it's just one particular Monday until you are able to get the systems in place where things are working smoothly. And then you can be working more reactively after that. So I think it is all about finding those pockets of energy and the types of tasks that are high value that are going to fit into those pockets of energy, and then protecting that time and energy so that you can get the most value possible out of that particular mental state that you are maybe more suited to getting into during whatever time it is that you have decided is a good time to do that sort of thing.
So I'm hearing, set aside some particular time to be able to proactively kind of think through some of the things that are on your plate, limit distractions, have like a clean workspace. And at that point in time, just tackle whatever the topic is at hand. Am I misinterpreting that?
I think that's accurate. One thing I did really mention is that I mentioned 7 different mental states in the book. It's kind of a mouthful to rattle off 7 different mental states. But when it comes to, say, thinking about systems, that is what I think of as the prioritized mental state. It requires a lot of prefrontal cortex activity and a lot of mental energy. It's a very energy hungry part of the brain. And it helps to be in a rested state for that. And it helps to be generally alert, to be doing that sort of executive thinking, because the prefrontal cortex, the great prioritizer, is considered sort of the CEO of the brain. Now, on the other hand, myself as a writer, my mornings, for example, are very important to me. And it's not necessarily a great time for me to be doing prioritization type of thinking, where I am thinking about systems and such in my business. That's maybe a Monday afternoon activity for me than it would be maybe a Monday morning activity, because the mornings are very sacred for me because I'm a little bit groggy in the morning. And so while it is a usage of some of my best energy, it's not necessarily the same energy that I would use for that executive type thinking, because the prefrontal cortex, which is so good at executive thinking and planning, is actually kind of the enemy of creativity. It sort of is always communicating with different parts of the brain and trying to sort of get them to agree with one another. And if you're feeling a little groggy in the morning, it's kind of the prefrontal cortex is sort of out to lunch or still in bed, so to speak. And actually, that's a really good time for ideation. That's a really good time for brainstorming. Not necessarily that you still have to follow the brainstorming rules, that you're not just trying to have ideas and then evaluate whether it's a good idea or not. You're just trying to have ideas, because your brain is doing a lot of crosstalk between different regions. And that is a mental state in which you can have those sort of collisions between various parts of your mind and come up with great ideas that might be for marketing, and it might be for systems and things in the business. They're less likely to come out as, ideas that are ready to go. They're more of like a general starting point, so to speak. So yeah, I think certainly the idea of dedicating time and space to a particular task applies to this. It's just that it also helps to parse what mental state it is that you're trying to get into for that particular type of task. And certain times and certain places and certain environments are going to be better suited for certain mental states than others.
So I want to share a couple things as a way to kind of tee up and frame my next question. And I'll just share kind of a couple personal examples. So when I was an advisor, there were two overarching responsibilities that I had. One was meeting with clients and trying to find new clients. And the other one was leadership. I had a number of advisors on my team in which I was responsible for developing them and help them grow their business. And what I found myself doing is I would go from, pick any day of the week, like a Wednesday, I'd go from a coaching session to a client meeting, to a client meeting, to a coaching session, and so on and so forth. And I'd kind of mix up my days with different types of activities. And what I found was I was never truly present in any of those interactions, because I was always thinking about that next thing. And I was super drained at the end of the day. So what I ended up doing is on Mondays and Fridays, it was all leadership, nothing else. And Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays was all clients and nothing else. So I could put my leadership hat on for an entire day, and I could put my financial advisor hat on for an entire day and not have to switch that out throughout the day. And I found that to be very helpful for me personally. The other example that I wanted to share, and then I'll ask my question, is I'm probably the most like lucid and creative very early in the morning. So if I want to, tackle something that's very creative, if I'm doing that at 5:30 in the morning, I don't know what it is, but like my fingers are just moving on the keyboard and things are just kind of really, really flowing to where I don't even feel like I'm thinking. My fingers are just doing the work for me. But I've also heard about folks that have that same feeling late in the evening as opposed to in the morning. So my question is, based on those two examples, time of day for a certain type of energy and dedicating certain days to certain activities, my question is that the same for everyone? Is it different for everyone? And if it is different, how do you audit that for yourself to identify how you should structure your calendar, your day for you personally?
I think it is different for everyone. I think there will be a tendency for, like you mentioned, mornings to be a good creative time for people because, well, I mean, look at how addicted people are to coffee. They want their coffee right away, which I would say before you have your coffee, you go ahead and have some sort of ideation session because, you have that sort of grogginess. At the same time, I also think that if I were to switch my schedule around, that evenings could also be a very creative time for me too, but it would kind of depend upon how I was using my energy throughout the rest of my day. So there's not really a one size fits all solution to it. It has to be a result of your priorities, your particular energy flows, and any sort of non-negotiables that you have going on in your schedule. Thus, your question about auditing it, right? I think it can be kind of overwhelming to try to figure it all out from the beginning, but I think an easy practice would be just at the end of the day, write down when was the time that you felt really aligned energetically, and maybe write a little bit about what kind of mental state that was, what kind of work that was, and what was a time that you didn't feel so aligned with it. Repeating that over the course of a few weeks, I think you start to see some patterns. And ideally, you get to a point where you can kind of sketch out your ideal week like you did, where you say, okay, this is really important for me to do this leadership stuff. And it's really important for me to do this client stuff. I want to be totally present for both these things. They're both very important. And, put the leadership on Mondays and Fridays, and then the client work on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. For myself, it ends up working out also. It can be valuable to think about sort of your leftover energy a little bit. Like for me, Friday afternoons are often a time when I'll either want to be doing something kind of social, like for having this podcast conversation on a Friday afternoon, and or administrative. And that will be something where if my accountant sends me some financial statements on, say, Monday or a Tuesday, I will immediately use a Gmail plugin called Boomerang to have it leave my inbox so I don't see it at all, and then have it come back to me on, say, Friday afternoon. Because I've used my most valuable energy, I've used my creative energy in the week coming up to that point. And Friday afternoon is a good time for me to do that administrative stuff that, doesn't necessarily require my best energy. And so, yeah, thinking about, what are your priorities? For me, like if I tell you that mornings are the best time for creative work, and because you spend your mornings doing creative work, you're not able to meet with clients as a financial advisor, that might be kind of a problem. But for me as a writer, that becomes vitally important. I can't schedule something on a morning that's going to interfere with that, because I didn't just lose, say, 15 minutes of my morning by scheduling that thing. I lost like that entire day's valuable creative output or productivity. And if it's, say, like a Monday morning, well, then I kind of lost an entire week, because I sort of work in a weekly rhythm where Monday morning is going to be the time where all the stuff that I brainstormed on, say, the Friday morning and from the previous week has incubated over the weekend, and is going to tend to come to me in like a well thought out form. And that's where I find that I get some of my most valuable creative output. So for example, this Monday, I sat down and banged out almost 2,000 words on a chapter for my next book that I had really been struggling on. But that was because the previous Friday, I had done some outlining and thinking and getting myself prepared for what state am I going to be in Monday morning. So it doesn't have a lot to do with what your goals are and your priorities, but I think that that's a good way to think about it. I keep on mentioning incubation, so I hope we get a chance to talk about that, because that can be a really valuable way to get a lot more out of a small amount of time. I don't want to push us to that just yet.
Well, and we'll certainly talk about that. And one of the things I really like that you said, and I suggest this to folks all the time, is whatever the task is, whether something needs to be done or something needs to be created or whatever it is. Like as an example, one of my clients, Niraj, he is launching a podcast, and it can seem overwhelming at the beginning when you say, okay, well, think about all the things that I need to do for a podcast. And what I really like that you alluded to is, which I think can be applied to this. You said, put together an outline first and kind of let that marinate, and then, get to the drawing board once you had a chance to connect in your mind the various points that you're looking to get across in whatever that thing is. And the saying that I always share with people, I was like, a podcast is, and this can be applied to almost anything. A podcast is like an elephant, and the best way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time. So, I actually suggested to him outline all the steps that are needed still to be able to launch that podcast, and then start picking away at those one piece at a time. And I feel like, and I apologize if this is the case, but I feel like I keep blurring the lines between mind management and time management, because time management has been such a natural thing for me, or at least something part of my upbringing, so to speak. So am I thinking about that right? Is that mind management related? Is that more time management? Help me understand that from your perspective, please.
Well, I think it depends how people approach things. And I do think that there are some people who are top-down thinkers and there are people who are bottom-up thinkers. This idea of, say, when you're starting a podcast, kind of putting together an outline of all the steps that need to be followed, it's great if you can execute that. I'm personally somebody who would really struggle with that because I'm not a top-down thinker. I'm a bottom-up thinker. And so for myself, like when I started my podcast, I just sort of made it, but also tried to keep myself from obsessing over the details of it. But each time that I did it, that's when I had what I call a sloppy operating procedure document. And there's the concept of SOPs, the standard operating procedure. And that's the type of thing that a bottom-up thinker like myself really struggles with, because it's extremely intimidating to think that I'm going to create this document that's going to have all the steps for me to follow, this process that I actually am not familiar with. So I need to actually do the process first. And by having what I call the sloppy operating procedure, that kind of gives me permission to suck in making my document a little bit. So I kind of always have these process documents that when I repeat a process, I just kind of barf in a few bullet points about it. And then the next time I do it, I return to it and I look at those bullet points. And that's where it's incubated a little bit. I've gone through the process. A lot of the unknowns are now known. And I'm able to, through enough repetition, start to improve that process document to the point where now I've got my podcast. I've got checklists. I've got Zapier automations set up where if I put in a date of a podcast episode into a spreadsheet, it automatically creates all the tasks in my task management system based upon the target date that I have set up there. So I've got all these great processes in place. But if I had attempted to come up with those processes from the beginning, I personally would have really struggled and I would have never done it in the first place. So this is where I think that maybe the distinction between time management and mind management there is that time management, it's the ideal. It would be ideal for me to know the processes up front, but I just don't. And I would struggle and end up not doing it at all because it would be this creative thing where I don't know the process because I haven't gone through it. And I'm trying to create a thing and I don't even know what it is that I'm making quite yet. And so being aware of those sort of emotional sticking points that might be there, and also aware of the energy sticking points that would be there, in that sitting down, trying to make the outline or the process document before I've gone through the process would be so draining for me that I just would run out of energy. And so that way it's a bit of an energy management thing. And then I get some episodes out, or maybe even do a sort of test episode. I did sort of test recordings and test episodes to kind of get a feel for things I didn't even release until I got to the point where I was comfortable with the quality to some extent, but also understanding that, my 300th episode is going to be better than my third episode, and understanding that I'm going to be constantly growing in that way.
I was just taking a note because I didn't want to forget, but you brought up the concept of top-down thinkers, bottom-up thinkers. They approach things in different ways. What if someone doesn't know what type of thinker they are? How could someone like me who's working with them ask, or what are some questions that I can ask to help identify that? The other reason why I ask too is clients may be top down or bottom up thinkers, and perhaps advisors can tailor their presentation accordingly. But if they were to ask a client, are you a top down thinker or a bottom up thinker? The client may not know what that means. So what are some ways to help identify that?
Yeah, maybe something great will come out of the process of me explaining it, which is a bottom up way of doing things. This is a little controversial, but Myers-Briggs gets a lot of flack for being pseudoscience. And I understand why. There's certain methodological flaws, scientifically in like the Myers-Briggs personality type indicator. But there are certain parts of it that have scientific support, such as the introvert extrovert. I don't want to say dichotomy, more of a spectrum. And that's part of the problem of the Myers-Briggs is I think that it says there's a dichotomy when in fact there's a spectrum. But another one I don't think that gets enough lip service is the spectrum between perceiver and judger. And some congruent concepts or a congruent concept in psychology would be somebody who is high or low on need for closure. And so the idea of a perceiver is there's somebody who needs to take in a lot of information before they make a decision. They're very comfortable with ambiguity. They're maybe resistant to making decisions. And then judgers are actually uncomfortable with ambiguity. They want closure. They want to make a decision and say things are going to be this way or that way. I'll start to spitball this. I would guess that a lot of financial advisors are probably J's, and a lot of artists are probably P's. And it just showed up exactly in the two different ways that we were talking about approaching starting a podcast. Is you're talking about making an outline and putting the steps down. And that's something that is probably makes total sense for you, probably works for you, might work for your client as well. That's something that I would just have such a hard time with. And I'm glad that you brought up the point about talking to your clients, because your clients are probably not all J's. They don't necessarily tend to be J's. They want a J injection, right? They want somebody who's decisive, who's going to tell them exactly what steps to follow. But they're somebody who's kind of waffling around, maybe has a lot of indecision. Maybe you talk to them for like 9 months before they finally committed to working with you. There can be sort of signs like that you might notice, might be able to tell what the sort of cognitive style that somebody has. Are they comfortable with ambiguity, or are they somebody who clearly wants to make decisions really, really quickly? This is something that I wish I had like a J answer for. It's something that I should explore a bit. But myself as a writer, I know that like behind me, I've got a typewriter and I type on the typewriter, and it's a very bottom up process because what goes in that typewriter is not going to end up electronically in an article that I write or a book that I write, but it allows me to sit there and write and spit things out while those things incubate. And then later on, I go back and just rewrite the entire thing. Whereas somebody who's a J, they want to sit down and write an outline. I'm somebody who, when I was in English class in school, and the teacher would say, write an outline, my response was always like, well, how am I going to write an outline? I don't know what's in the paper. I don't know what I'm going to say. So I can't write an outline. I've got to say this stuff first before I can write an outline. That gives you maybe some clues for things to look for. I wish I could tell you something like, oh, what if they have Velcro shoes, then that means they're a J or something.
That's funny. Well, one thing, and this is not entirely related, but this is more so for folks to identify if someone is an analytical thinker or more of like a conceptual thinker, or analytical learner versus conceptual learner, where before an advisor, presents their financial plan and recommendations to someone, asking in advance, are you the type of person that wants to know what time it is, or you want to know how the watch actually works and function? Like, how do you tend to learn best? So again, not entirely related, but it still allows them to tailor their presentation accordingly based on the answer to that question. So talk to me about incubation. I want to wrap up with that. You had alluded to, want to make sure we hit on that. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, this is very important. Incubation is incredibly valuable. You can get a ton out of very little if you understand incubation. And we have certain clues in our culture that we're aware of incubation. You've heard people say, oh, well, we should sleep on it if you're making a tough decision. And there's actually things that are going to happen if you do sleep on something. You have taken in the parameters of a problem, and then your brain is going to consolidate the memories of those different points that are relevant to that problem. And maybe any ideas that you had, if there were some that were bad, there's going to be some of those ideas are going to kind of fall away. That's something called fixation forgetting. And then, it's possible that the research indicates that your mind is also maybe working on the problem in the interim without you consciously trying to work on the problem. And so this is incredible if you can actually use it, but it's important that you actually learn the parameters of a problem before taking a break on it. So, for example, if I was speaking earlier about thinking about systems for your business, ways that you can improve the systems in your business and what priorities you're making, having like a brainstorming session, such as every Monday. The trick with those sort of things is that you can't come up with the idea and then arrive at the solution all at once. There's 4 stages of creativity. There's preparation, incubation, which is what we're talking about, illumination, and then verification. Illumination being that moment that you have the idea, preparation being learning about the problem, and then incubation being that time in between. And so this is something that you can use on a ton of different things. So if you're working on systems for your business, you might just, while you're waiting at the dentist, type a couple notes into your phone and then forget about it. Then you go do your dentist thing. And then maybe a couple hours later, you return to it and you'll find that your thoughts about it are more crisp. Now, the amount of time that you need between working on something in one session and working on it the next session is going to maybe depend upon how big and hairy of a problem is it. Maybe it is something that you do need to literally sleep on, or maybe it is something that you need to give yourself weeks of time between learning about the problem and then approaching it again. But it is something that you can use anytime that you have any complex issue that you are trying to deal with or ideas that you're trying to come up with, which is to just spend a very little amount of time and energy on something and then let your sort of passive genius take over until you return to it.
It's interesting because anytime like I'm on a call with an advisor and I need to help them out with something creative, or I'm on a call with another firm and there's potential collaboration and we need to come up with ideas to do so, I always say, all right, give me a few days. I like to let this marinate and kind of think through it fully. And then I'll send you an email afterwards, in a few days to share the ideas that I came up with. And it's amazing because right when I'm on that call, I have a couple things. And then like I sent one out the other day and I had 5 things that had come to mind over a 2 or 3 day period. And then as I was writing it, a brand new thing came to mind that I hadn't thought about. So that's kind of par for the course with what you just said. Also, I'm going to give my mom a call after this and tell her growing up, I was not a procrastinator. I just needed time to think.
You needed time to think. And also maybe you were somebody who preferred to think about things by yourself independently and not in a room or in a conversation with people. I mean, there's different people have different ways that they like to ideate too. And so that's totally the way to go about things. I think so often we have a meeting with somebody where maybe we're trying to think about different ideas, and then we're also trying to come up with the decision to make action happen. And that can be the right choice sometimes if it's not of super high consequence. It's not a super complicated problem that can work. But if it's a big thing that is very important, then giving yourself some space and giving yourself some of that incubation time can be really helpful. And this is one of the ways that mind management is decoupled from time management. It's interesting how the actions that you're taking aren't always directly leading to the results. So for example, I know that I've found very many times where maybe I go on a vacation for a week, or I go on a hike, or I go get a massage, or I do some sort of relaxing thing that isn't related to work. And then it's not necessarily while I'm on the vacation or while I'm on the hike or while I'm on the massage. It just happens to be when I get back from vacation, like maybe a week later, after I come back from the hike the next day, the massage, like a couple days later, where I'm in that effortless mental state. I have a pretty good idea that it's because of something that I was doing before. And now it's resulting maybe in that extremely high, extremely valuable idea that I'm having in this moment.
Yeah, when I did goal setting this past year, usually I'm very good with being able to come up with goals and things I want to accomplish. And this year, I just, for whatever reason, really struggled with that exercise. And I've heard this before. I didn't think of it for myself, but I confided in someone and they were like, just grab a notebook and go for a walk. And anytime you think of something, just stop and write it down. And that like change of environment was really helpful for me.
Yeah. And that's something that I notice is very different about the way most people approach, say, yearly goals in our culture. It seems to be that people start thinking about their goals for the year like on January 1st. And I kind of have a tradition of roughly around Thanksgiving to January 1st, I'm purposefully trying to not get into an analytical state about things. I'm trying to relax and keep an open mind about things just so that when I do return to thinking about what I want to do with my year as the year is approaching, not all at once, that I will have that fresh mindset. I will be stepping back a bit. And that's when you start to have some of those higher value ideas.
For sure. Well, David, one of the things that we ask all of our guests as a way to distill a reading list for our folks is a book that's had a big impact on them. And I know the book that you chose, which is fairly fitting to this conversation, is called Getting Things Done. Why'd you pick that book?
That book changed my life. I can't be the first one who's mentioned it on the show if you're putting it together.
I believe you are.
Oh, wow. It's incredible. It's just a requirement in this world where we have so many inputs coming at us all the time, to be able to understand what is actionable, what is not actionable. Why is this project that I have on my to-do list not getting done? Why am I not able to think of what I'm going to do next? And being able to put that all into a system where you're appropriately engaging with the inputs in your life is foundational. And it's really what I sort of built mind management on top of, because as David Allen told me when I was interviewing him on my podcast, David Allen, the author of Getting Things Done, he was saying, well, this is about freeing up your creative energy, is that you find that once you feel comfortable with all the different inputs and things that need to be attended to in your life, and they're all in the appropriate place, well, then you have all this amazing creative energy. And that's where I thought that I would contribute, would be, well, what do you do with that creative energy? How do you focus that? And that's what led me to writing Mind Management, Not Time Management.
Based on the way you teed it up, I regretfully admit that I haven't read it yet, but I just typed it into Amazon and scooped it up. So it will be here in a couple of days and I'll crack it open.
I think that you will love it.
Awesome. Well, cool. David, if I am listening to this and I want to learn more about you, you mentioned a newsletter, you mentioned a podcast, you mentioned a book. Where can I go to find all that stuff?
You could just go type in kadv.co. That's my little short URL that will take you to my website. And that's where you can find my podcast. That's where you can sign up for my newsletter. And then if you're active on social media, you can find me on @Kadavy on Twitter and Instagram. David Kadavy if you're a TikTok person.
On TikTok. Love it. Well, cool, David. I appreciate the time. I appreciate the insight and the conversation, and I hope to chat soon. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, David. I appreciate the invite.
Love it. Take care.